Something unusual is happening around Shedeur Sanders, and the sports world is starting to notice. Every week it seems like another media personality is taking a shot at him. Recently, comments from Cleveland reporters like Jason Lloyd and radio host Adam the Bull sparked a heated debate about Sanders' ability, leadership, and future with the Cleveland Browns. But what happened next is what really caught everyone's attention. Fans didn't stay quiet. Callers began challenging those opinions live on air, pointing to film breakdowns from former NFL quarterbacks and analysts who see something completely different when they watch Sanders play. Suddenly, the narrative that seemed so confident started getting questioned from every direction. Then things escalated even further when sports analyst Garrett Bush stepped into the conversation and pushed back hard against the criticism. And once that debate went viral, the entire story around Sanders took a dramatic turn. Because what started as simple analysis quickly turned into a full-blown media firestorm. It didn't take long for the criticism surrounding Shedeur Sanders to trigger a reaction from the people who watch the game the closest, fans. The moment certain media personalities began questioning Sanders' ability, the response online was immediate. Clips from sports talk shows started spreading across social media, and suddenly thousands of viewers were dissecting every argument being made about the young quarterback. But the pushback didn't stay online. It spilled directly onto the airwaves. During a live segment featuring Cleveland reporter Jason Lloyd, one caller decided he wasn't going to sit quietly and listen to what he believed was unfair criticism. Instead, he challenged the narrative head-on. The caller made a simple but powerful point. If analysts were claiming Sanders couldn't read defenses or process the game properly, then how were so many former NFL quarterbacks seeing the exact opposite when they studied his film? That question immediately shifted the tone of the conversation. Because fans weren't just defending Sanders emotionally, they were pointing to specific examples. Film breakdowns from experienced quarterbacks were circulating online, showing plays where Sanders diagnosed defensive coverages, adjusted protections, and delivered accurate throws under pressure. One of the most commonly mentioned analysts in those discussions was Chase Daniel, who has become well known for his detailed quarterback film reviews. Daniel had analyzed several plays involving Sanders and explained how the young quarterback identified defensive looks and made the correct decisions. For many viewers, that raised an obvious question. If former NFL quarterbacks, people who actually played the position at the highest level, were praising aspects of Sanders' decision-making, why were some media voices acting like he had no idea what he was doing? The caller pushed that point directly toward Lloyd during the debate. And that's when the conversation started getting uncomfortable. Because instead of responding with another opinion, the caller kept asking for something very specific: proof. He wanted to know exactly what film analysts were supposedly watching that proved Sanders couldn't read defenses. At the same time, supporters of Sanders were pointing out something else. Players inside the locker room were speaking positively about him. According to comments circulating online and in interviews, several Cleveland Browns players had already expressed confidence in Sanders. Defensive leaders like Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward were among the names fans frequently mentioned when discussing support inside the building. To supporters, that mattered more than anything a talk show host might say. Because players see the work every day. They watch the quarterback in meetings. They watch him during practice. They watch how he carries himself in the locker room. And if teammates believe in someone, that belief often spreads quickly throughout the entire roster. But the debate wasn't only about Sanders' performance. It was also about the tone of the criticism. Many fans felt certain analysts were speaking with absolute certainty about Sanders' limitations, even though his sample size in the NFL remained extremely small. In football, where development can take years, declaring a young quarterback incapable after limited exposure felt premature to many viewers. And as more fans began raising those concerns, the conversation started evolving into something bigger than a simple debate about football. It became a clash between media narratives and the people challenging them. And just when that argument reached its peak, another voice stepped into the spotlight, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the entire discussion. That voice belonged to Garrett Bush. And once he entered the debate, things escalated quickly. Just when the criticism surrounding Shedeur Sanders started gaining traction, something unexpected happened. Instead of the debate staying inside sports talk shows, it moved into a completely different arena, film study. And that's where the entire conversation began to shift. Because when former NFL quarterbacks started breaking down Sanders' tape, the story suddenly didn't look as simple as some critics were suggesting. Analysts who had actually played the quarterback position began pointing out plays that told a very different story. One of the first names that kept coming up in the discussion was Chase Daniel. Daniel has built a reputation online for doing detailed quarterback breakdowns, explaining reads, defensive coverage, and decision-making in ways most casual viewers never notice. When he analyzed Sanders' film, he didn't describe a quarterback who was lost or incapable. Instead, he pointed to several examples where Sanders correctly diagnosed defensive coverages before the snap. On certain plays, Daniel showed how Sanders identified blitz pressure, adjusted protections, and delivered accurate throws into tight windows. Those clips quickly started circulating online. And once fans saw those breakdowns, they began asking the same question. If experienced quarterbacks could clearly see these reads happening on film, why were some media voices claiming Sanders couldn't read defenses at all? The debate didn't stop there. Another respected quarterback voice joined the conversation, Kurt Warner. Warner, who has spent years analyzing young quarterbacks, has a reputation for being one of the most thoughtful film evaluators in football. When Warner reviewed Sanders' tape, he didn't pretend the young quarterback was perfect. Like any developing player, there were areas that needed improvement. Timing could improve. Certain reads could become faster. That's normal for young quarterbacks adjusting to the professional level. But the key difference was how Warner framed the conversation. Instead of declaring Sanders incapable, he described a quarterback who was still developing but already showing encouraging signs. Warner highlighted moments where Sanders remained calm in the pocket, worked through progressions, and made smart decisions despite pressure. For many viewers, that balanced analysis stood in sharp contrast to the more extreme claims being made elsewhere. And that contrast fueled even more debate. Because suddenly, there were two very different narratives circulating at the same time. One narrative suggested Sanders struggled to read defenses and lacked the processing speed required for the NFL. The other pointed to film evidence showing a young quarterback capable of diagnosing coverages and executing difficult throws. Naturally, fans gravitated toward the evidence they could actually see. Social media clips comparing these film breakdowns began spreading rapidly. People paused the footage frame by frame, pointing out the exact reads Sanders was making before delivering the ball. The more those clips circulated, the more the conversation began changing. Instead of simply accepting criticism at face value, fans and analysts started demanding more detailed explanations from the people making those claims. What film were they watching? What plays proved Sanders couldn't read defenses? Those questions became harder and harder to answer. And just when the debate seemed like it might calm down, another voice entered the conversation, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the entire narrative head-on. That voice belonged to Garrett Bush. And once he stepped into the debate, the conversation exploded even further. While the media debate around Shedeur Sanders kept getting louder, something even more important was happening behind the scenes. And for many fans, this part of the story mattered far more than any argument on a sports talk show. Because inside the Cleveland Browns locker room, the tone appeared completely different. Instead of criticism, many players seemed to be showing confidence in Sanders. Now that's significant for a simple reason. Players see things that the public never does. They see every practice rep, every meeting, every moment of preparation. They watch how a quarterback carries himself around the team and how he responds when things get difficult. That kind of insight doesn't come from highlight clips or hot takes. It comes from being in the building every day. And according to comments circulating among fans and analysts, several respected Browns players had already expressed support for Sanders. Two names that came up repeatedly were Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward. Both players are among the most respected leaders on the roster. When veterans like that speak positively about a quarterback, it carries real weight inside a locker room. Supporters of Sanders pointed out that these players weren't just praising his talent, they were talking about his confidence and presence. Quarterbacks often have to command a room full of elite athletes, and that kind of leadership doesn't come from statistics alone. It comes from personality, preparation, and belief. And according to those who support Sanders, that belief is exactly what he brings. Fans also began mentioning other teammates who appeared impressed with his approach. Players talked about his swagger, his calm demeanor under pressure, and his willingness to step into a leadership role despite being relatively new to the situation. That type of attitude can spread quickly through a team. When a quarterback carries himself with confidence, it often affects the entire offense. Receivers run routes with more urgency. Offensive linemen fight harder in protection. Running backs trust the play design because they believe the quarterback is in control. In football, confidence can be contagious. But what made the situation more interesting was the contrast between what players seemed to be saying and what certain media voices were claiming. While critics questioned Sanders' ability or readiness, the locker room reactions painted a much more encouraging picture. That disconnect didn't go unnoticed. Fans began asking a simple question. If the players who actually practice with Sanders every day believe in him, why were some commentators so convinced he couldn't succeed? Of course, locker room praise doesn't automatically guarantee success on the field. Many players have received early support from teammates before eventually struggling once real games begin. The NFL is an unforgiving league, and potential must eventually turn into production. Still, those internal reactions matter. Because if a team believes in its quarterback, that belief can create momentum that carries through an entire season. And as the debate around Sanders continued to grow louder, the difference between media criticism and locker room confidence only made the story more fascinating. But the moment that truly changed the tone of the entire conversation was still coming. Because when Garrett Bush decided to challenge the narrative directly on air, the debate exploded into something even bigger than anyone expected. Just when the debate around Shedeur Sanders seemed completely divided between critics and supporters, one moment on live radio changed the tone of the entire conversation. And it came from Garrett Bush. During a heated segment discussing the quarterback situation around the Cleveland Browns, Bush stepped in and did something that immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Instead of simply defending Sanders emotionally, he challenged the entire logic behind the criticism. His main point was simple. There's a huge difference between speculation and certainty. Bush pointed out that many analysts were speaking about Sanders as if his career had already been decided. Some were acting like the young quarterback had no ability to read defenses, no chance to develop, and no real future as an NFL starter. And according to Bush, That kind of definitive judgment made absolutely no sense. Because quarterback evaluation has always been one of the most unpredictable parts of football. History is full of examples where analysts were completely wrong about young quarterbacks. Players who were once labeled as can't-miss prospects sometimes struggle, while others who were doubted early eventually become stars. Bush reminded listeners that development is rarely linear. A quarterback might struggle early and then improve dramatically once the system around him stabilizes. Coaching, protection, play calling, and roster talent all influence how a young quarterback performs. Without those pieces in place, even talented players can appear worse than they actually are. That's why Bush pushed back against the idea that Sanders could already be judged so harshly. He also addressed another important issue: the way information spreads in sports media. Many reports about players come from anonymous sources or internal conversations that fans never see directly. Sometimes those reports are accurate, but sometimes they're incomplete, misunderstood, or simply wrong. Bush explained that hearing something from inside a building doesn't automatically make it the full truth. There are always multiple perspectives. And when media personalities treat speculation as absolute fact, the conversation can quickly spiral into unfair narratives. To illustrate his point, Bush even referenced previous situations where public criticism turned out to be incorrect. In one example discussed during the segment, claims had circulated about Sanders sitting in the back of team meetings rather than showing leadership. But video later surfaced showing him sitting in the front of those same meetings. Moments like that, Bush argued, prove how quickly rumors can become accepted stories even when they're not completely accurate. And that's where his biggest criticism of the media narrative came in. He wasn't saying analysts shouldn't evaluate Sanders. Evaluation is part of sports. But what Bush challenged was the certainty. The idea that some commentators were presenting their opinions as final conclusions rather than ongoing observations about a young player still developing. For many fans listening, that argument made sense. Because Sanders hasn't played enough games at the NFL level to draw definitive conclusions. A small sample size rarely tells the full story about a quarterback's potential. Bush's message was clear. Criticize the play if you want, analyze the film if you want, but don't pretend the future is already written. And once that point landed, the debate surrounding Sanders started to shift again. Because if the criticism wasn't as definitive as some people claimed, then the possibility remained that the entire narrative could change very quickly. Just when the conversation around Shedeur Sanders seemed like it couldn't get any louder, another layer of controversy entered the picture: the never-ending quarterback debate surrounding the Cleveland Browns. For months, it felt like every sports show had a different idea about who should lead Cleveland's offense. One week it was a veteran quarterback rumor. The next week it was a draft prospect. Then suddenly, another name would appear out of nowhere. The list just kept growing. At different points in the discussion, analysts floated names like Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, and Malik Willis as possible options for Cleveland. Every few days it seemed like a new quarterback was being suggested as the real answer for the Browns. And each time that happened, the same cycle repeated itself. A new quarterback rumor would gain attention. Fans would debate it. Media personalities would spend hours discussing whether that player would fit Cleveland's system. Then the rumor would quietly fade away, and another name would replace it. For many fans watching this unfold, the pattern started to feel almost absurd. It seemed like people were constantly searching for alternatives without ever seriously considering the quarterback who was already right there in the building. That frustration became a major talking point during the debate. Supporters of Sanders pointed out that Cleveland had multiple opportunities to bring in other quarterbacks, if they truly wanted to move in a different direction. Teams around the league constantly explore trades, sign veterans, or aggressively pursue new starters when they believe their quarterback situation isn't stable. But those moves never fully materialized. Despite all the speculation, none of those rumored quarterbacks ended up taking over the Browns' offense. The carousel of names kept spinning in conversations, but the reality inside the organization remained unchanged. And that raised an important question. If the Browns truly believed another quarterback was the better option, wouldn't they have already made that move? That's exactly the argument some analysts started making. The absence of a major quarterback acquisition suggested something interesting. It hinted that Cleveland might actually believe Sanders deserves a legitimate opportunity to prove himself. Of course, speculation about quarterbacks will never completely disappear. The NFL is a league built around the position, and teams are constantly evaluating every possible option. Rumors are part of the culture of football coverage. But the endless debate around Cleveland began to reveal something deeper. It showed how quickly narratives can form around young players. Instead of allowing Sanders time to develop and show what he can do, the conversation kept jumping ahead to hypothetical replacements. Every new rumor created the impression that Cleveland was desperately searching for someone else, even though no such move actually happened. And that disconnect became one of the biggest sources of frustration for Sanders supporters. Because from their perspective, the quarterback debate wasn't really about football anymore. It had become a cycle of speculation that kept repeating itself. Meanwhile, Sanders continued preparing, practicing, and waiting for the opportunity to show what he could do on the field. And if that opportunity finally arrives, there's a chance the entire conversation could change overnight. Because in the NFL, rumors and debates only last until one thing happens: kickoff. At the center of the growing debate around Shedeur Sanders is a much bigger issue, one that goes far beyond a single player or a single team. It's the ongoing clash between media narratives and the reality of what actually happens on the field. Sports media thrives on strong opinions. Hot takes drive attention, debates create views, and bold predictions keep audiences engaged. But sometimes that style of coverage can blur the line between analysis and certainty. And according to critics of the current narrative, that's exactly what happened in the conversation surrounding Sanders. Some commentators began speaking about Sanders' abilities as if the verdict had already been delivered. Statements about his supposed weaknesses were presented as final conclusions rather than ongoing evaluations. Words like can't, won't, and never started appearing in discussions about a quarterback who had barely begun his professional career. That level of certainty raised eyebrows among fans and analysts alike. Because the truth is, football history is filled with examples of early judgments turning out to be completely wrong. Quarterbacks who struggled in their first appearances sometimes developed into stars, while others who were praised early in their careers failed to live up to expectations. The NFL has always been unpredictable, especially when it comes to developing quarterbacks. That's why some analysts, including Garrett Bush, argued that the discussion around Sanders had become overly definitive. Evaluating a young quarterback based on a small sample of games, they suggested, ignores the countless variables that influence development: coaching, roster stability, offensive schemes, and experience. In other words, the story isn't finished yet. Another key issue raised during the debate involved the way rumors and second-hand information can spread within sports coverage. Reports sometimes emerge from unnamed sources or internal conversations inside team facilities. While those reports can occasionally reveal important insights, they can also be misunderstood or incomplete. That's where narratives can start forming. Once a rumor gains momentum, it often gets repeated across multiple outlets. Over time, speculation can begin to sound like fact, even if the original information was never fully confirmed. In Sanders' case, several early claims about his behavior and preparation became talking points across different shows and discussions. But when fans and analysts began examining some of those claims more closely, the picture looked less clear. One example involved reports suggesting Sanders sat quietly in the back of team meetings rather than taking leadership seriously. However, later footage and discussions circulating online appeared to contradict that idea, showing him actively participating and sitting near the front of meetings. Moments like that fueled skepticism toward the narrative. Supporters of Sanders argued that the situation demonstrated how easily perceptions can form around young players before their careers have even truly begun. Once a storyline takes hold, whether it's positive or negative, it can shape the way people interpret everything that follows. Every throw, every interview, every mistake becomes filtered through that existing narrative. That's the media versus reality problem in its simplest form. The media conversation moves quickly, often forming opinions based on limited information. Meanwhile, the actual process of developing a quarterback happens slowly, over months and years of work that most fans never see. And when those two timelines collide, controversy is almost guaranteed. The debate surrounding Sanders may eventually settle once his performance on the field provides clearer answers. But until then, the tension between narrative and reality will continue shaping the conversation around one of the most talked about young quarterbacks in the league. After all the debates, hot takes, and viral arguments, the conversation surrounding Shedeur Sanders eventually comes down to one simple but powerful question. What do the Cleveland Browns actually believe? Because while media discussions have been filled with speculation about different quarterbacks, Cleveland's real actions tell a much clearer story. Over the past several months, rumors connected the Browns to a long list of possible quarterback options. Analysts floated names, insiders hinted at potential moves, and talk shows debated which veteran might arrive to compete for the starting job. But when people look closely at what actually happened, something interesting stands out. Most of those moves never materialized. Despite all the speculation, Cleveland never pulled the trigger on a major quarterback acquisition. There were no blockbuster trades that brought in a new franchise leader. There wasn't a sudden free agent signing meant to push Sanders aside. Instead, the Browns allowed the situation to continue developing. That silence can mean many things in the NFL, but one possibility has started gaining traction among analysts. Cleveland may genuinely believe Sanders deserves the opportunity to prove himself. Now, that doesn't mean the decision is final. NFL teams constantly evaluate their rosters, and quarterback competitions happen every year across the league. Coaches and executives always want depth at the most important position in football. Still, the fact that Cleveland hasn't aggressively replaced Sanders raises an important point. If the organization truly believed he couldn't lead the offense, they would likely have made a move already. Teams rarely hesitate when they feel their quarterback situation is unstable. Around the league, franchises routinely trade draft picks, sign veterans, or draft new prospects in order to upgrade the position. Quarterback urgency is one of the most powerful forces in professional football. Yet Cleveland's approach has been noticeably different. Rather than chasing every rumored option, the Browns appear to be taking a more patient path. That patience could signal that the team wants to evaluate Sanders under real game conditions before making any long-term decision. And that evaluation process matters. Quarterbacks often require time to adjust to the speed, complexity, and pressure of the NFL. Even highly drafted prospects sometimes struggle early before eventually finding their rhythm. Coaches understand that development can take more than just a few appearances. That's why many observers believe Cleveland's true plan might be simpler than the speculation suggests. Give Sanders a chance. Let him work within the system. See what happens when the offense begins to settle and the roster around him stabilizes. If he succeeds, the Browns may have found a motivated quarterback who feels overlooked and hungry to prove critics wrong. Those types of players sometimes develop into leaders who carry their teams further than expected. But if he struggles, Cleveland will still have the information needed to make future decisions. Either way, the organization benefits from learning what they truly have at the position. And that's why the real question facing Cleveland isn't about rumors, debates, or media narratives. It's about belief. Do the Browns believe Sanders can grow into the quarterback who leads their offense forward? Because if they do, the upcoming season could become the moment where one of the most debated young players in the league finally gets the opportunity to change the entire conversation. After all the arguments, viral clips, and heated debates, the truth about Shedeur Sanders might actually be much simpler than people think. Right now, there are two completely different stories being told at the same time. One version comes from certain media voices who believe Sanders still has major questions to answer. They argue that his game needs development, that the NFL is far more complex than college football, and that it's too early to assume he can become the long-term answer for the Cleveland Browns. And to be fair, that part isn't unreasonable. The NFL is the hardest league in the world for quarterbacks to succeed in. Every season, highly talented players enter the league with huge expectations, only to discover that the speed, complexity, and pressure of professional defenses are far greater than anything they experienced before. So yes, Sanders still has things to prove. But the other side of the story paints a very different picture. Supporters point to film breakdowns from experienced quarterbacks like Kurt Warner and Chase Daniel, who have both highlighted plays showing Sanders diagnosing defenses and making difficult reads. They also point to the confidence shown by teammates inside the Browns' locker room, players like Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward, who understand how important leadership and belief are to a team. Then there's the perspective offered by analysts like Garrett Bush, who reminded everyone that judging a quarterback after such a small sample size simply doesn't make sense. Because if football history has taught us anything, it's this: quarterback development rarely follows a straight line. Some players explode onto the scene immediately. Others struggle early before eventually figuring things out. And sometimes the players who face the most criticism early in their careers end up becoming the ones who prove everyone wrong. That unpredictability is exactly what makes the Sanders story so fascinating. Right now, he's standing at the center of a massive conversation. Media personalities are debating his future. Fans are defending him passionately. Analysts are breaking down every snap he plays. But none of those debates will ultimately decide what happens next. Only one thing will: what he does on the field. Because the NFL has a way of settling arguments faster than any talk show ever could. Once the season begins, narratives start to fade and results take their place. A quarterback who performs well can silence months of criticism in just a few games. And if Sanders does succeed, the conversation will flip almost instantly. The same people questioning him today may suddenly start talking about his resilience, his confidence, and the chip on his shoulder that fueled his success. But if he struggles, the critics will feel validated. That's the reality of playing quarterback in the NFL. The spotlight is constant, the pressure never stops, and every performance becomes part of the larger story. Right now, that story is still being written. And that might be the most important truth in this entire debate. Because whether people believe in Shedeur Sanders or doubt him completely, the final chapter of this story hasn't happened yet. And when it does, it could change everything.